I assume that we will see the social dimension from the EUROSTUDENT data lens. Please.
So, me again. I'm also involved since nearly 20 years in this EUROSTUDENT project, where the countries do national student surveys and then combine the data on a European level to make them comparable and so on. So it's not an international study like the PISA study or whatsoever. It's the countries themselves do the survey, and we just collect the indicators from those surveys. Of course, they are based on a core questionnaire, and the questions are the same, but it's a combined study, so to say. The last round, the sixth round of EUROSTUDENT results on the student surveys was just published in beginning of this year. 28 countries participated, and the results are based on answers from about 300,000 students across Europe. And you can see here the countries that participated. That changes from time to time. We are already in 2 weeks starting the next round, and then Spain will rejoin, for example, and so on. So not all countries participate in every round, but most of them already have participated once. And here in this presentation, I have the same, which I said in the beginning. It's really not about rankings, but you can use the data and look for similar systems that are similar to your country, and try to compare your country with those countries. And that does not always mean it's the neighboring countries. It could be really a country far away. And if you look on different questions, on different indicators, it can also be that in this indicator, other countries are more comparable. It's not always the same countries that might be the best to compare. And as I already said in the first presentation, one of the most important variables to understand the differences is age. And here is the age slide from EUROSTUDENT. We have a cutoff already at 25 years. So blue are all the share of students that are below 25, and gray are the share of students above 25, and the black dots in the middle, that's the average age. And again, you see all Scandinavian countries to the left, and Serbia very much to the right, next to France. And here the average age of the students is about 23 years. But if I look to Iceland and so on, they are nearly 30 on average. So you need a lot of people above 30 to end up with an average of 30. It's two different words, actually. And you also, why do you present them in one chart? But they also have the same topics: funding, housing, fees, grants, and so on. So it's still worth that they are in here. But also within Serbia, you can differentiate different groups of students have a different average age, even if the spread is not so big like in other countries. But those students working more than 20 hours a week, they are on average nearly 27 years old out in Serbia. Without PhD students, yeah, sorry, did not say this. This is only short courses, bachelor and master. Or those with a delayed transition who started later in their life studying, they are on average 25 years. And then on the right side, you have those not working, they are 22. Or those financially depending on the family, they are 22 and a half. So there's also within the Serbian system at least 4 or 5 years of a difference of different groups, and if you try to target them, you should be probably aware of this. First topic, access. Here again is this transition period from school to higher education. Dark blue is those what we call direct accessing, so within the first 2 years, and delayed transition means at least 2 years or more. And in many countries it's a lot more. We only have the 2-year because when we invented this indicator several years ago, there were still many countries with a mandatory military service. And so if the boys at least had to do military service, we would not put them in the delayed category because it was mandatory anyhow. That's why we have this 2-year gap. But we mean actually going immediately after school, finish school in spring, and in autumn you start studying or do a military service in between. And actually, albeit the student population is quite young in Serbia, 16% with a delayed transition, that's even more than the average of these nearly 30 US student countries. So this is it's different to other countries. There must be something interesting in that group, and we can see this in the follow-up slides as well. So in Scandinavia, it's clear. They enter with 28, 29, 30. They come from working and so on. In Serbia, I'm not sure. This is a more interesting case. On the other hand, what you can also see, that was also in this Bologna slides already, there are very, very few other alternative access routes. Instead of doing the Matura right at the end of the school life. There's hardly any possibility to do the Matura later on, or maybe there's a possibility, but they don't. People don't use it, don't do it, or there's a second way of recognition of prior learning or whatsoever. So it's only 2% entering in a different way, and that also has an impact on the composition of the student body and who is in and who is not in. Then here I just picked out some of the highlights where Serbia might be a little bit different to the other countries, because I know that my Serbian colleagues will go more into detail. What I found at least surprising, I already mentioned it, that the gender segregation by field of study is far less explicit than in most other countries. You're shaking head. It's not. And especially that in ICT you have a high share of female students, and it's 47% in Serbia, but it's 20% on average of the Euro student countries, and it was 20% for all the Bologna countries. So 47 is really extraordinary high in that sense. You have a comparatively low share of students with children, of course, because they're quite young, the students here, but 3% is really quite low compared to others. On average, across all the countries, we have 10. And you have a comparatively low share of students with impairments. It's only 7%. On average, we have 18%. But these impairment measures, I have to admit, they seem to have in this service also kind of a cultural issue. In Eastern European countries, it's more that people report visual impairments, what you can see, mobility impairment, cannot see or cannot see properly, and in the Western countries, people also report more of chronic disease, internal disease, which you cannot see. We have a follow-up question in the Austrian questionnaire on those students, and 2/3 of those having an impairment, they say that no one will realize that they have. You cannot see it. And this group, this invisible impairment, mental disease is a big issue in many higher education systems. They are less likely in many countries, or they are afraid of admitting it, or they do not regard it as an impairment. That can also be. That one has always. This is not a doctoral diagnostics. That's what the students themselves report. And sticking on the students with impairments, those 7% in Serbia were then in a follow-up question asked if they, according to their self-perception, they receive sufficient support from, be it the university, be it from the social security system in the country. And here, the blue, the dark blue, is the share of those who have an impairment that they say the support is entirely sufficient. And here again, Serbia is to the right, so 11% of those with impairment say that the support is sufficient, and then plus 10% who say it's partly sufficient. That is also relatively low amounts of the students. So small share of students with impairment, and then they also report that they seem to lack support. But this is subjective data from the opinion of the students. So this would be the social background like we measure it since a long time. In EUROSTUDENT, sorry. And it's a pity that Serbia was not able to deliver this data. Here again, we contrast the background of the students with the educational level of the parents in the whole society. And it's as far away you are from the ideal line in the middle as worth, or yes, more unequal is your system. And for example, you see Germany is far away from this line. That sometimes surprises people. In Germany, they know it already, because in all the PISA studies and so on, they always blamed you're one of the most social selective systems in the world. So it's for them it would not be a surprise. But here we have Switzerland very close to that line. We have Ireland quite close. We have Iceland quite close. So it's Portugal as well. Portugal is one of the countries that invested in these ISCAT 5 short classes recently quite a lot. And for Austria, which is also not so far away, really it is the high share of these students with delayed access and second chance route. They come from a different social background, and that's the difference between Germany and Austria, for example. That's why Austria is far closer, because Germany only has very small, these second chance route students entering. Then we also have questions about how do you feel in university, and I picked out one here, is that the students feel there is a lack of belongingness to higher education. It's the wrong place. I'm not, I should not be here. The system, I do not fit to the system, and so on. And here actually, Serbia is below the average. Average would be 14% of the students would say this. In Serbia it's 12. But what is really more interesting here is the difference between students with high or with low higher education background. Because you would suppose that when the parents have studied, they already know the language and everything. Parents can tell them, explain them how it works, what is a lecture, what is a seminar, what is an exam at the university, and so on. So they would feel far more belonging to higher education than kids of a worker who have no assistance at home and not explaining the environment. Yeah, and that is what is seen here between the light and the dark blue. In some countries there's no difference, like in the Netherlands, for example. Both groups have the same feeling of belonging, and in other groups, in other countries there's a larger gap. But actually that was the first time we tried this question, and we expected in all countries a far wider gap. And this is actually a good sign for all the countries that the difference is not so big. Time budget is also really interesting. The weekly time budget of the students. What we show here, starting with Serbia, on average of all students, so bachelor, master, and all types of programs, they spend 16 hours at the university in lectures, plus 19 hours for personal study time. By that we mean they're going to the library, they prepare for exams, they learn, they write seminar papers, or they're writing their thesis, and so on. So in total they end up with 35 hours on average a week. And you can see that is quite in the top of the range of the countries. Plus then we have the hours the students working aside to studying. And then it's only 6 hours in Serbia. We have a small share of students working here, and on average only 6 hours. And then you can see again the Scandinavian countries where the students on average working 20 hours, 19 hours aside. So they are nearly all actually studying part-time, if you want to say it like this. But including the working hours, so in Serbia the student week ends up with a little bit more than 40 hours, whereas in other countries, when you add the working times, they end up with more than 50 hours a week for studying and learning. And actually what is also quite interesting is the relation between presence, so in lectures, and personal self-study. And 35 hours together in Serbia, but only 16 hours in lectures. That is one of the lowest shares how the students divide their time for studying. So it's one of the, it's not, the number 16 is perfectly average, but if you compare it in relation to the study time, the personal study time, so they spend quite a lot on self-studying compared what they are sitting in lectures. I think there's only one country that has a lower ratio. So that is also, and the data is available, so you can analyze it for different fields of studies and so on. So 3 more snapshots. Employment, that's what I already said. The blue, again, is the share of those students with a regular paid job during the whole lecture period. So it's not working 1 week helping in a restaurant and the rest of the I'm learning at home. You have only 11% of the students regular working during the whole lecture period. In this share of countries, the smallest, together with Italy. In Germany, Estonia, and so on, it's more than 50% of the students regularly working. And then the gray part is those occasionally from time to time, but when there's exam period, I'm not working, and before and after, I'm working a little bit. But altogether, combining studying and working seems to be a small problem in Serbia, but maybe because certain people are not accessing. Because this, you only have these students with direct access, so you're lacking these kind of people who have to work more for sustaining themselves. We also ask those who are regularly working, we ask how they perceive themselves. Are you a student working aside, or are you a worker studying aside? And that makes a big difference for policy, because there's always, they have to work to the same them, but no, they want to work because it's their profession and they want to study aside. It's completely flips the thing. And in Serbia, most of the working students, 70%, regard themselves primarily as students. In other countries, it's only half of the working, which regarding them, first of all, I'm a student. No, they are first of all workers, and they do evening classes at universities, for example, when they have these part-time systems. And then if you want to implement measures or so, it makes a big difference if you support students or if you support workers studying. And if you combine these two charts, so 28% of the working students regard themselves as workers. Out of 24% working, that means 7% of all students would regard themselves, I'm primarily a worker. And that is compared to 18% in all countries. That is quite a low share. So they do this kind of dual study, actually, even if it's not named like this. Assessment of the financial situation. Do you have any financial problems? Below, we have very serious financial problems. It's 9% in Serbia. It's the same than average. A little bit more. It's 18%. Average is 17%. So it's in that sense, it's really average. But on the other hand, you do not have at all financial problems. It's a little bit less than average, so you have a broader middle class, so to say, when it comes to the financial background. And I'm saying this because there are several other charts in the report where you can see that here it's the middle class among the students. It can be completely different to the society, because only certain people go to universities. Composition of student funding, where does the money come from? And here definitely you can say Serbia is number one in this sense. It's nearly 80% of the, it's 90%, it's 88% of the amount of money the students have available every month comes from the family. That's the highest share across all these EU student countries. And then 7 from self-earned income. We've seen it's only a small group working. 3% from national student support and 2% from some other sources. And that is really quite interesting, but you have to look a lot and go into detail for all the different countries. Keep in mind the different age structure. So if your student population is 30 years and older, it's very unlikely that the parents are still funding them. But also keep in mind the grant systems. Before, we've seen that in Scandinavia, more than 50% of the students get grants, sometimes even 80 or so.
But it's also low. It's low.
Yeah, but at least it contributes to your budget. But it reduces the amount that comes from the family. So it's no wonder that we have the Scandinavian countries here with the oldest population, but also with the different grant systems than the others. About the grant system, here again we have a little bit more complicated chart. On the x-axis you see the share of recipients, so how many students get a grant from the public authority. That in Serbia would be nearly 20%. And then on the y-axis is how much contributes the grant to the budget of those who receive it. So it's about 20% receive the grant, and on average it contributes 20% of the student budget. And here again you see the Scandinavian countries, they have a completely different system of the welfare state. They have higher taxes which are funding all this. So it's not to say we all have to become like Sweden, just to see that there are differences in understanding. Here we have 70, 80, 90% sometimes receiving, and it contributes 60, 70% to the grants. And by just putting these average lines in the middle, of course you can cluster the countries into 4, and then you will see what in this chart are your neighboring countries. So those for comparison. In that case, it would be Georgia, Latvia, Slovakia, Lithuania, Croatia, but also Austria, Portugal, very more or less similar to Serbia, and Scandinavian countries more or less on the opposite of the scale. Housing. Not really surprising, or maybe a little bit surprising. Very young student population, so 49% of the students live with the parents. Not so surprising, we have very young populations in the other countries. But, for example, if you remember, France was also a very young population next to Serbia. And here they have 33% only living with the parents. So in that case, for example, France could be a good country for comparing with. 11% in student accommodation, that's quite small amount for such a young student population. But France only has 14, so that's not the explanation for the big difference. And of course, it depends on the size of the country. France is much bigger, so more people, when they move or go somewhere for studying, then they are too far away from the parents to be able to live at home. And as we've seen, less with children, because many do not have children. Serbia, 14% living alone outside of the student domain. That's comparatively quite a high share for this very young student population. Mobility, my last topic. Students' mobility experience by type of study-related stay abroad. We do not, in EUROSTUDENT, we try to cover many different activities you can do abroad. It's not only enrolling. What is gaining more and more importance in many countries is internships, work placement, and it's also subsidized with the Erasmus program, so you can go for gaining working experience abroad. But we also have any other type of study-related activities. We mean doing research, for example, for your master thesis, going for a language class, if it is related to your studies, and things like that. So we see in Serbia 2%, and this is, so explaining this is a survey of students, so that is not the final mobility rate. That is a snapshot, and we have students in first semester in here and students in the last semester. So it's an average of them, and this is not meant to measure a definite mobility rate. We have to ask the graduates for getting a mobility rate. We do mobility for what is on the next slide is what are the obstacles to mobility, and that it makes more sense asking the students in the moment when they considering being mobile. But still, it makes sense to have in the background that here only 2% enroll somewhere, and 3% do actually enrollment plus internship abroad, but 16%, the largest share for doing more or less short trips abroad. So that is also very different pattern to many of the other countries. How is it funding? What is the primarily source for going abroad? And that is a little bit surprising, but it's because so many do other things abroad. Only 40% of the students who have been abroad said my primary source was an EU study grant, so Erasmus or similar. If you look at the other countries, that's mostly all the Eastern European countries are on the left side, with quite high shares, at sometimes up 60, nearly 70% say the Erasmus grant is the most important. In Serbia it's not, because so few really enroll abroad and they go for language classes or whatever, and they are obviously not eligible. What also follows from this is in some countries we have far more mobile students than Erasmus statistics show you. That is, for example, especially the case in Scandinavia. They have a high share of what we call free movers. They go without any program. They just can come to Vienna and enroll at the university. Then they are still mobile students, but they do not pop up in any of those usual statistics. You really have to ask the students. And that could a little bit be the case for Serbia as well. Because these 40% compared to the neighboring countries is surprisingly low, at least for me. So maybe they are more mobile, but going without any of those programs. And internships is a growing importance in many countries. So when we ask the students who do not plan to be mobile and have not been mobile, what are the biggest obstacles to it? Here I put Serbia versus the average of the European countries. In all countries, it's always the funding. I'm not sure, even for the rich countries like Switzerland or whatever, maybe it's not 60% of the students there, but funding is always the biggest obstacle. So it is in Serbia, it's a little bit more than the average. Next would be separation from partner, children and friends. That's a little bit lower in Serbia. That's again because population is a little bit younger. And then we have lack of information provided by my higher education institution on how I can be become mobile. And that is really a big difference compared to the average. At least students do not feel informed quite well. Next one, which is relatively problems with access regulations to the preferred country. So they want to go to countries where they probably need a visa. That's why there's a difference to the mostly EU countries. That's, I think, a well-known issue. What I could have mentioned in between, lack of motivation, that is not such a big issue. That's more for the older populations in other countries, of course. When you are 32 or whatever, you are less likely to want to be mobile. But here it's also actually good news, I think, for Serbia. To be mobile is a low benefit for my studies at home, far less than on European average say this. We have countries where a lot of students complain, I don't go because it's not helpful for my studies, but here that is not one of the reasons why only few are going. That was the very quick run through the EUROSTUDENT. What I should say is you find all the reports. There's some special reports and most of the national reports from the countries. Of course, mostly they're in the national language, but you can access them all there. And there's a database, and you can play around with all the indicators and pick the countries you want to compare your country with, and download all the numbers, and then play around on Excel as much as you like. It's all free of access at the EUROSTUDENT homepage. Thank you.